Matt Damon recently exposed what Netflix tells its filmmakers behind closed doors, and what he said completely explains why comedy movies stopped working, including hard rules that Netflix forces into every script. But what nobody realizes is that this entire system is about to collapse. And when it does, we're gonna get the best comedies we've seen in decades. Just not for the reasons you think. The easiest way to see how badly this broke is to look at something you're already familiar with. Remember back in the day when it felt like there was an American Pie movie coming out every year? Except only 4 of them were with the original cast of characters we came to love, and the other 5 were, well, not that. The same can be said for the original EuroTrip movie and its direct-to-DVD sequel, Road Trip Beer Pong. The originals are movies that we still find ourselves rewatching, while the spin-offs and sequels are movies that most people try to forget about. I'll admit, I probably enjoyed these direct-to-DVD 2000s comedies more than you did, but there's just an undeniable difference in quality between this.
No, we don't know. Why don't you tell us? What the hell is that? Did you kill a cheetah?
And this. These movies didn't just have lower budgets and weaker casts and crews, they were complete afterthoughts to studios. Like, they weren't even intended to be good movies. And what happened next is where everything begins to connect with where we're currently at with the streaming platforms. Because this exact concept in modern times hasn't been limited to a sequel or a spin-off, but instead the entire genre. Comedy movies used to make up roughly 20% of the box office, but have since dwindled down to as low as 5%. That's not a trend, that's like borderline extinction. But even that doesn't tell the full story though. Because Hollywood didn't stop making comedies, they just made almost all of them straight to streaming instead. This didn't happen by accident though, because there was a full-on shift on how comedies were being made. Which means we didn't lose comedy movies, Hollywood just replaced them with something worse. And this is where the real damage starts to take shape, because once you lower the standard, it doesn't just affect a few movies, but everything that comes after them. Straight-to-streaming movies effectively replace straight-to-DVD movies, meaning instead of getting a bunch of American Pies and road trips, we've been flooded with an endless supply of beta houses and beer pongs. So it should come as no surprise that with the rise of streaming, comedy movies as a whole have fallen off. But that's only scratching the surface. This is where things really start to get concerning, because it's not just these low-budget comedies on streamers. You may have thought there have been some bigger budget straight-to-streaming comedies in recent years, and you're right, but there's a reason why these comedies too were destined to never be great, and once you see what's been going on behind the scenes, it's impossible to unsee. The biggest example that comes to mind is the 2024 comedy Ricky Stanicky, starring John Cena, Zac Efron, Jermaine Fowler, and Andrew Santino, while being directed by Peter Farrelly. On paper, this sounds like the kind of 2000s style comedy that we've been desperately craving. Like, with those ingredients, this should have been slam dunk, easily the best comedy we've seen in years. But instead, we got something very different. The movie had its moments, almost solely because of John Cena, yet the movie never even came close to Cena's better comedic works like Blockers.
Eggplant agreement.
Yeah, they got an agreement to make eggplant parmesan.
No, eggplants are dicks in teenage emoji language.
What?
Or Fairly for that matter. The same guy behind movies like Dumb and Dumber, There's Something About Mary, and Hall Pass. Which is exactly the problem. So what exactly is causing it to go from that to this? Well, the movie never took any risks whatsoever, and never even gave itself a chance to be great. Instead, it just felt bland. And that's not an accident. It was actually all thought out by the studio. Because Casey Neistat, who you may know from his ever-famous YouTube channel, who spent the past 2 decades in the film industry, shed light onto why this is.
I produced the Safdie brothers' first 2 movies. I had a show on HBO, and I worked directing traditional TV commercials. In the last decade, the focus has shifted away from the creativity part of creator and shifted towards the economy part. Cinema in the 1970s, peak cinema. And now we have Netflix, which has all of the data.
So what he's essentially saying is that back in the day, movies, like YouTube, were experimental, artistic, and creatively free. The goal wasn't retention, but to make the best movie possible. And that alone fundamentally changes everything. This era of freedom was especially relevant with comedy movies up until about the mid to late 2010s. That's why we really had the golden era of comedy movies from '99 to then. And once that disappeared, everything started to collapse with it. Because it was then that streaming took over, and suddenly those kinds of comedies just stopped getting made. Which is no coincidence. Because for streaming platforms, the number one priority is to optimize for retention and algorithms. In other words, the sole focus of a straight-to-streaming movie is to ensure that as many people as possible watch until the end, rather than making movies that chunks of people absolutely love. So the goal isn't to make classics, but instead movies that people won't turn off. And those are two way different things. Which is exactly why this is when the genre started to fall apart. In the case of Ricky Stanicky, maybe they were able to make a movie that the average person is more likely to click on and watch until the end, but no one will put it in a list of their top 10 favorite comedies of all time. Whereas a movie like American Pie is going to have serious drop-off and retention issues. Prudes will click off within a minute, people who get offended by everything will click off, and some will just not connect with it and click off. But that's exactly what made these movies work so well, because the people who do watch it from start to finish are somewhat likely to genuinely love it. Some of whom, like me, will consider it to be one of the greatest comedies ever made. Hell, I even got a huge poster of it, and I rewatch the movie every year. But all of this is lost when the entire genre is built for an algorithm. You stop getting movies that people love, but instead ones that people just tolerate. Like, find me one person who has a giant Ricky Stanicky poster in their room, or any straight-to-streaming comedy poster in their room for that matter. Which makes me think, if movies aren't released in theaters, do these straight-to-streaming comedies even have posters? Put simply, for the past decade, comedy movies have been soulless pieces of content rather than artistic endeavors. And audiences can feel that, even if they aren't consciously aware of why. And that's not even the worst part, because that's just surface level. And what Matt Damon recently revealed on the Joe Rogan podcast is the most damning part of the whole story.
The lights are on, other shit's going on, very different level of attention. Netflix, standard way to make an action movie, you usually have like 3 set pieces, and you spend most of your money on that one in the third act. And now they're like, can we get a big one in the first 5 minutes? We want people to stay.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be terrible if you reiterated the plot 3 or 4 times in the dialogue.
So in addition to making movies for algorithms, Netflix is now making movies for people who don't even watch the movie when it's on? You can't make this up. Imagine if American Pie had a break every 15 minutes for Jim to say, all right, we have this pact that we need to complete by prom night. I keep on striking out, so does Finch. Kevin just can't get his girlfriend to put out, and despite his looks, Oz finds a way to say the wrong thing at every turn. Like, what the hell? This is absolutely devastating for cinema and completely destroys what made comedy movies work in the first place. And this really explains everything. When you start optimizing movies for people who are playing on their phones, you don't just water down the movies. You lose the memorable characters, one-liners, and storylines that made these movies what they are, and then you end up with something that's completely forgettable and disposable. That's why when you think of Adam Sandler, you think of the classics before he signed a solo away to Netflix, like Happy Gilmore, Billy Madison, and Waterboy, and not whatever he's up to nowadays that nobody watches on Netflix. Because Sandler's classics were movies that were actually built to be loved. And the worst part is that Netflix is not trying to contain this awful fire they started, but they're trying to now make it the industry standard. Their CEO said less than a year ago that movie theaters are outdated, and even had the audacity to suggest that he's saving Hollywood. Yeah, saving Hollywood by turning movies into background noise. Sure. They even tried to take over Hollywood by purchasing Warner Brothers, which would have given them control over one of the most powerful film studios. And as someone who doesn't just love comedy movies, but cinema as a whole, and goes to the movies multiple times a week, this news was both shocking and heartbreaking. By the way, my directorial debut, which premiered in theaters, is now available for free on Tubi, which I'll be including a link to in the pinned comment. Based on everything we just talked about, Netflix buying Warner Brothers wouldn't have just been a blow to comedy movies, it would have fundamentally changed how movies were made. So when Paramount stepped in and outbid them, it wasn't just good news, it potentially saved the theatrical model. And sure, Paramount isn't the ideal owner either, but I'm cautiously optimistic that the next administration will break up the monopoly, whereas Netflix buying Warner Brothers could have been a straight-up existential threat to cinema as we know it. And if you think this is extreme, just wait until you see what the actual data says about streaming movies. Because the craziest part is that none of this even makes financial sense. Like everything both Neistat and Damon said are all for nothing, because the data says the exact opposite of what these platforms are doing. And the best way to see this is by looking at two of the biggest comedies ever made, because both of these are literally the exact opposite of what streaming platforms are trying to do. Both Wedding Crashers and The Hangover flew completely under the radar of the studios and were given complete creative freedom. Not a list of parameters and boxes to check like a straight-to-streaming comedy.
Crashers was the same thing. We were really left alone to kind of build these characters, create these flawed guys, have those 3 weeks to sort of pitch ideas, write scenes.
We flew so below the radar, even during making the film. They were making Watchmen and Terminator and all these movies that are huge, huge franchises. So when you make a tiny little comedy, relatively speaking, it's you fly below the radar in a great way.
And here's the thing. These movies are from 2 decades ago, yet I know you know both of them. Odds are, you really enjoyed them as well. And I guarantee you can't name a single straight-to-streaming movie that was anywhere near as good as either of these. In fact, I'd be willing to bet you can't even name 10 straight-to-streaming comedies, period. Yet I know you can name at least 30 comedies from the era of The Hangover and Wedding Crashers. Wedding Crashers and The Hangover are universally loved. Look no further than their IMDb and audience scores on Rotten Tomatoes. Many, myself included, have them both in our top 5 comedies of all time. But they also accomplish something rare in that they're universally loved by critics as well. And it doesn't stop there. Because even if society only cares about the quality of the film, the only thing Hollywood actually cares about is how they performed financially. Well, they both went on to be 2 of the highest grossing R-rated comedies of all time and absolutely obliterated their budgets at the box office. So let's get this straight. Netflix is, quote, saving Hollywood by making generic comedies that nobody watches, while the antithesis of that model is literally out here pulling off the trifecta of winning over audiences, critics, and making massive profits. Someone make this make sense. And if I look especially tired today, it's not just because I'm tired of Netflix's bullshit. I mean, that's definitely part of the equation. But I also just got back from the NCAA Men's Basketball National Championship last night. Roughly a 10-hour round trip, and I didn't get much sleep at all. But I got to see Michigan win a national championship in person, so hey, worth it. But what I learned about the actual data on straight-to-streaming movies has to be the most bizarre development of this entire story, because it contradicts literally everything Netflix's CEO has said, and is the strongest case yet for why even Netflix of all companies desperately needs to release their movies in theaters. Turns out, Netflix's CEO is completely full of shit, which reminds me of a Christopher Hitchens quote. Meaning he's so full of it that if you sucked it all out, there would literally be nothing left of him. But David Zaslav, the current CEO of Warner Brothers, spilled the beans on what the numbers actually say about straight-to-streaming movies versus movies that are theatrically released before finding a home on streaming, saying, I've seen the data. A movie that opens in theaters performs 5 times as well as when it goes directly to streaming. 5 times better. Let that sink in. So if a movie has the opportunity to make money at the box office, then we'll make 5 times more on a streaming platform than had it gone straight to streaming. Why are we making straight to streaming comedies again? The good news is that Zaslav isn't the only studio CEO who saw this data, because we're in for a seismic shift in how comedy movies are going to be made and distributed. And this means everything we've been talking about is about to change. Even though we haven't seen the full effects, believe it or not, the change has actually already started to take shape. You just haven't noticed it yet, because we've already seen the Netflixication of Hollywood start to die. You could see it directly happen in movie theaters, especially with comedy movies. The first, but also biggest example of the domino starting to fall was the Mean Girls remake in 2024. What happened with this movie was not just important, but it also started the most important chain reaction we could have gotten. Bear with me, I know this was by no means a classic, and nowhere near as good as the original, but this is more so about what this all means and less about the quality of one specific film. Mean Girls 2024 was always meant to be a straight-to-streaming movie, hence the downgrade in quality from the original that you and I both love. Well, at the last second, Paramount had a change of heart and decided to give it a theatrical release. A comedy movie going to theaters. Wow. What a concept. And financially, it didn't disappoint, raking in over $100 million off of its $36 million budget. And going off of what David Zaslav shared about streaming data, it undoubtedly did superior on streaming than it would have done had it just been dumped on streaming right away. And this isn't a one-off. The horror movie Smile was supposed to be straight to streaming as well, but changed last second like Mean Girls. And thank goodness it did, because the two Smile movies have done over $300 million at the box office, and it's now being turned into a franchise with number 3 currently in development. That just doesn't happen if the original Smile went straight to streaming. This could only help the case for future movies to get theatrical releases. And the trend didn't die there, because 2 comedies released just last year are the perfect examples of what would have been straight to streaming in prior years. The Naked Gun reboot and Freakier Friday both cleared $100 million and made profits at the box office. I personally didn't really care for The Naked Gun. It had a few funny moments, but it wasn't really for me. Freakier Friday was decent. I definitely liked it more. But again, it's not about the quality of these specific movies, but what they mean for the future of comedy movies. Because there's this old narrative that comedies didn't have a theatrical audience anymore, and that the genre was meant purely for streaming. But all of these comedies completely disprove this, and even if they weren't the best, they clearly followed the straight-to-streaming framework, so I can't blame them for not being classics. But their success is only the beginning, because what happens next is where everything changes. Because this is the best news that you, I, and anyone who loves comedy movies could possibly get at this point. Yes, the outlook for comedy movies the past decade has been bleak. And even though I really try to be optimistic, there was a point a few years back where I genuinely feared that good comedy movies would never come back. It honestly felt like these kinds of movies were just a thing of the past. And while the comeback has been dreadfully slow, Hollywood has always moved at the speed of a snail. But the success of movies like Mean Girls 2024, Naked Gun, and Freakier Friday have laid the groundwork for classic comedies to be made again. Because these box office numbers were not an accident. They were a signal, because there are multiple comedies coming out that have the potential to be classics, but would have been ruined by streaming services even just a couple of years ago. Like Scary Movie 6, and the original R-rated comedy starring Paul Rudd and Nick Jonas that somehow has completely flown under my radar. But there's one that matters more than all of them and tells us everything. Because this isn't just one movie, but it's a signal to the entire industry. It's the biggest sign that genuine comedy is coming back, and that's Judd Apatow's new comedy that's coming to theaters next February. It was greenlit last year and will be his first directed comedy in 5 years, and his first to go to theaters in 7. And this matters way more than you think, because his last movie tells you everything you need to know. The Bubble was a straight-to-streaming Netflix fiasco. It clearly followed all of Netflix's set rules, and it didn't even feel like a Judd Apatow comedy, probably because it wasn't in a way. I mean, when you strip someone of that much creative freedom, it essentially stops becoming a Judd Apatow comedy and starts becoming a Netflix slot monster. The point is, it was by far his weakest film, but in no way do I actually blame him. But after that, he couldn't get anything greenlit for several years. Until now. And it's the perfect timing, because more and more studios are finally starting to give the middle finger to the concept of the straight-to-streaming comedy, and even to streaming platforms as a whole. As Universal, the studio producing Apatow's new comedy, just announced that they're moving their theatrical windows to a minimum of 45 days, which means these movies are being treated like actual movies again. Which undeniably means that Apatow will have as much creative freedom as he did back in his heyday with The 40-Year-Old Virgin and This Is 40. And the same can be said for the future upcoming comedies of various other studios, as Disney has already committed to 60-day windows, and these decisions will no doubt put pressure on other studios to follow suit. Hell, even Amazon of all studios has jumped on the theatrical trend. After committing to releasing 13 movies theatrically every year, they've already said they're going to up that to 16 starting next year. And when one of the biggest streaming platforms even jumps on the theatrical train, you know the shift is real. It also means we're in for a lot more classic comedies and a lot less streaming slop. Straight to streaming movies as the default is starting to die, and no genre will benefit more than comedy. And for the first time in nearly a decade, we're finally about to feel it. While we no doubt should celebrate what's to come, remember when comedy movies used to be great? Like in the case of The Hangover, studios were completely clueless back then too, as this was never supposed to get made. Somehow, the story behind The Hangover is even more insane than this one, and I take you on its crazy journey here